world under the afternoon sun. Nothing here suggests we're standing at the edge of everything we thought we knew about human civilization. The landscape is austere, ancient, carved by wind and time into soft ridges that roll toward the horizon like the spine of some sleeping giant. And beneath this quiet earth lies a secret that will force us to rewrite the entire story of human ambition. In 1994, a shepherd was moving through these hills near the town of Sanliurfa when his eyes caught something unusual in the dust. Stones. Not random rubble, but carved stones. Worked stone. The kind that meant intention, purpose, and knowledge. He reported it to local authorities, and word eventually reached the ears of a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt. What happened next would become one of the most earth-shattering discoveries in archaeology, a discovery so profound that it would force historians, anthropologists, and scholars of human development to completely reconstruct our understanding of who we are and what we're capable of. But here's what makes this discovery truly unsettling: this site is nearly 12,000 years old. Let me say that again. 12,000 years old. That means it predates the Egyptian pyramids by 5,000 years. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates agriculture itself, at least, agriculture as we thought it was developing. This wasn't supposed to exist. There's no place for it in the neat, orderly narrative we've constructed about human progress. And that's precisely why it's the most important archaeological site you've probably never heard of. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, which translates to Pot-Belly Hill in Turkish, a modest name for an immodest revelation. When Klaus Schmidt first arrived in 1995, he wasn't looking for a revolution. He was documenting pre-pottery Neolithic settlement patterns in the region. He found stones that appeared to be worked, intentionally shaped. The sort of work that requires planning, community coordination, and sophisticated understanding of geometry. He began excavating methodically, carefully, as archaeologists do, scraping away millennia of dust with brushes and trowels. What emerged from the earth were T-shaped pillars. Massive, carefully carved limestone monoliths, some reaching 16 feet tall, weighing 7 tons. But pillars alone don't break history. It was what was carved into them that changed everything. Animals. Scorpions. Foxes. Birds with wings spread in predatory grace. Wild boar. Snakes. And most chillingly, abstract symbols whose meaning remains encrypted in antiquity, signs and shapes that suggest ritual, astronomy, or something so foreign to our modern mind that we don't have language to contain it. These pillars didn't stand alone. They were arranged in purposeful configurations, set into stone sockets, organized into what appeared to be temples or gathering spaces. Multiple structures, carefully designed, architecturally sophisticated. Someone understood space, weight distribution, and the psychology of the monumental. Someone had decided that their stories and their beliefs were important enough to carve in stone and arrange in ceremony. The shock wasn't just the age. It was the implications. Every assumption in the archaeology textbook gets flipped upside down. We believed that sedentary settlement came first, then social organization, then religious expression. But here was religious expression on a massive, monumental scale occurring 11,000 years before the agricultural revolution that supposedly enabled humans to settle down and build permanent structures. Here were people organizing as communities, moving massive stones, moving them for miles, through difficult terrain, to build something that was purely spiritual, purely meaningful. Yet what they found next was even stranger. As Schmidt and his team continued excavating, they discovered not just one ring of pillars, but multiple layers. Different periods of construction spanning nearly 2,000 years. Different epochs, different designs, different theological expressions. This wasn't a single event, it was a sustained commitment. A culture that came back again and again, generation after generation, to add to this sacred place. They kept building. They kept carving. They kept shaping stone into symbols of something transcendent. And then, and this is where it gets truly unsettling, they buried it. Intentionally. Deliberately. They covered the entire site with earth and stone, as if they were sealing away a tomb. Not a gradual abandonment. not erosion or conquest. An intentional burial. The pillars, which had stood proud and visible for centuries, were covered completely, hidden from the world. The question that keeps Schmidt and his colleagues awake at night is still unanswered. Why? This discovery forces us to ask questions that archaeology hasn't been equipped to answer. Not because they're too mysterious, but because they're too provocative. Too challenging to the narrative of inevitable human progress. If hunter-gatherers could organize at this scale, could build monuments, could create and maintain religious ceremony, could attract enough people to move stones that weigh as much as elephants, then what do we really know about these people we dismissed as primitive? The conventional story goes something like this: humans were wanderers. Hunters and gatherers, scattered in small bands, following animal migrations, living a subsistence existence. Then, about 10,000 years ago, agriculture happened. People settled down. They grew crops. Population grew. Villages formed. Hierarchy emerged. Civilization was born. But Göbekli Tepe rewrites this story in a way that makes it far more interesting and far more human. What if monumental architecture didn't emerge from the need to protect granaries or mark royal tombs? What if it emerged from something deeper, from the human need to express meaning, to create something that would outlast us, to say to the future, we were here. We believed. We gathered and we witnessed. We made something sacred. That realization transforms Göbekli Tepe from a historical artifact into a mirror. It reflects something about us that transcends millennia. The impulse to build. To gather. To create meaning from stone and symbol. To reach toward something greater than ourselves. When Klaus Schmidt died in 2014, he left behind questions that haunt the archaeological world still. What were these people trying to communicate? Why did they return, again and again, to add to this site? What purpose did the T-pillars serve? Were they representations of ancestors? Gods? Abstract cosmic principles? The most obvious clue is the animals. The carvings are strikingly naturalistic for such an ancient period. A scorpion with its tail curved in threat. A boar rendered with such anatomical detail you can almost hear it snort. A fox, so detailed that you understand not just its shape but its character. A serpent, coiled and dangerous. These weren't random decorations. They were chosen. They meant something. They carried significance in the world view of these people who lived on the cusp of civilizational change. Some scholars argue that Göbekli Tepe was constructed by shamanic communities engaging in elaborate ritual hunting ceremonies. The animals carved into the pillars were the animals they hunted, the animals they depended on for survival. By rendering them in stone and gathering before them in ceremony, they may have been attempting to influence their hunts, a form of hunting magic that exists in virtually every hunter-gatherer culture we know about. The monument becomes a space where they could commune with animal spirits, prepare spiritually for the hunt, and affirm their place within the larger ecosystem. But here's where it gets more complex. Recent excavations have revealed something that complicates this narrative significantly. Evidence of feasting. Massive quantities of animal bones, primarily from wild boar and gazelle, concentrated in specific areas. Not the remains of simple meals, but the debris of enormous communal banquets. Archaeologists have estimated that some feasts may have involved hundreds of people gathered in celebration, consuming enormous quantities of meat. The labor required to hunt this many animals, to process them, to prepare them for communal consumption, it would require coordination, planning, and social structure. Think about that for a moment. People gathering in the hundreds, traveling from distant settlements, converging on this location in the Turkish hills for ceremonies that combined hunting magic, feasting, and ritual. This wasn't a small village having a meal together. This was something closer to what we might now recognize as a festival. A pilgrimage site. A place where separated communities converge to reaffirm their connection to each other and to the sacred. The implications spiral outward. If people were gathering in these numbers, food distribution matters. Someone had to coordinate the hunt. Someone had to make decisions about resource distribution. Status differentials emerge. Leadership emerges. Social hierarchy emerges. The very conditions that archaeologists have long assumed were prerequisites for monumental building, social organization, leadership, surplus production, they're all already present at Göbekli Tepe, thousands of years earlier than we expected. Recent work has focused on another crucial aspect, astronomy. Some researchers have noted that the pillars may be oriented toward specific celestial events. Toward the rising of certain stars. Toward solstices or equinoxes. Dr. Rita Gorci from the University of Basel has proposed that the site functioned as a calendrical marker, a way to track seasons and cosmic cycles. If this is accurate, it suggests another layer of sophistication. These people understood their place in the cosmos. They were tracking celestial movements. They were encoding astronomical knowledge into stone. Yet the animals carved into the pillars resist easy interpretation. Some scholars have noted that many of the animals appear to be in states of transformation or distress. A snake biting a pillar. A boar that seems to be grinning or grimacing. Creatures that carry ambiguous emotional weight. This has led some researchers to speculate that the site may have been associated with shamanic trance practices, altered states of consciousness in which these animals were perceived as supernatural guides or manifestations of spiritual power. The psychoactive properties of certain plants known to grow in the region have been the subject of scholarly speculation. Could the ceremonies at Göbekli Tepe have involved ritual consumption of psychoactive substances? Could the animal carvings reflect experiences of ecstatic vision? It's a controversial theory, and it exists in the realm of educated speculation rather than confirmed fact. But it's the sort of speculation that emerges when we're confronted with evidence that doesn't fit our conventional frameworks. What's increasingly clear is that the people who built Göbekli Tepe possessed cognitive capacities, artistic sophistication, and organizational abilities that completely match our own. They weren't primitive. They weren't simple. They were people like us, with the same capacity for imagination, belief, and spiritual yearning. They just lived in a different ecological context and expressed their beliefs through different cultural forms. And here's the truly mind-bending part. This was all happening in the context of climate change. The archaeological record indicates that Göbekli Tepe was constructed during the pre-Pottery Neolithic, a period of significant climatic instability. The Younger Dryas, a brief cold snap that occurred roughly 12,800 to 11,700 years ago, created environmental stress across the Near East. Game animals became scarcer. Vegetation patterns shifted. Survival became more precarious. It was precisely during this period of environmental uncertainty that humans responded by building this magnificent monument to the sacred. Some theorists propose that this is no coincidence. That monumental building and ritual intensification are human responses to environmental stress. When the world becomes less predictable, when survival becomes less certain, humans seem to intensify their symbolic and spiritual practices. They create monuments. They gather in larger groups. They reinforce social bonds. It's as if monumental architecture is a form of adaptive resilience, a way of asserting meaning and community in the face of uncertainty. If this theory holds water, it suggests something profound about human nature. We don't respond to crisis by fragmenting. We respond by intensifying meaning. By gathering. By creating symbols and structures that transcend the immediate threat and point toward something eternal. Göbekli Tepe becomes less a monument to hunting magic and more a monument to human persistence in the face of an indifferent universe. Yet within a few centuries of its construction, Göbekli Tepe was abandoned. The ceremonies ceased. The pillars were covered. The site was sealed. No new construction occurred. It was as if this sacred place had served its purpose and then fell away from collective memory. The people who had gathered there dispersed, returning to their scattered settlements. The practice of agriculture intensified in the surrounding regions. Villages expanded. Social organization became more complex, but also more localized. The great pilgrimage sites of the pre-Pottery Neolithic gradually faded from the archaeological record. This is where the story becomes genuinely eerie. Archaeologists don't typically encounter intentional burial of entire ritual complexes. It's extraordinarily rare in the archaeological record. And when it does occur, it almost always indicates something significant: a shift in belief, a religious prohibition, a fear, a rupture in cultural continuity. Klaus Schmidt and his team documented this phenomenon meticulously. The pillars weren't simply abandoned and allowed to crumble beneath the earth through natural processes. They were deliberately covered. Stone was moved and placed over the structures. Earth was carried and spread. This was labor. This was intentional action undertaken by people who understood exactly what they were doing. They were consciously choosing to bury what their ancestors had built. Several theories compete for dominance in academic circles, and each reveals something different about the worldview of pre-pottery Neolithic peoples. The first theory centers on ritual purification or taboo. Perhaps the people who built Göbekli Tepe underwent a religious transformation. A new priesthood emerged. New beliefs superseded the old. The old temple, associated with discredited cosmologies or spiritual practices, had to be covered. It couldn't be destroyed, that would be sacrilegious, but it could be sealed away, returned to the earth, rendered inaccessible to the living. This interpretation places Göbekli Tepe within a long history of religious reformation and the suppression of previous spiritual systems. The second theory centers on fear. Perhaps something traumatic occurred at the site. A disease outbreak that killed many pilgrims. A disaster during a ceremony. A vision of apocalyptic significance interpreted by shamanic leaders as a sign that the place had become spiritually dangerous. Burial of the site would then function as a form of spiritual quarantine, removing the dangerous power from the living world and rendering it inert. A third theory, increasingly popular among scholars, proposes that the burial was an act of remembrance. A monumental tomb for a spirituality that was dying. A way of honoring what had come before while marking a transition to something new. In this interpretation, the people covering Göbekli Tepe weren't trying to erase it. They were trying to preserve it. They were returning it to the earth from which it came, creating a kind of time capsule that would survive the ages intact, waiting for someone like us to discover it and understand. The most unsettling interpretation, and the one that has captured the imagination of both scholars and internet theorists, centers on catastrophe. What if something dramatic occurred? A flood? An earthquake? A cosmic event? What if the burial of Göbekli Tepe represents not a choice but a necessity, an urgent covering of the site to protect it from some environmental threat? The region does sit in an active seismic zone. Earthquakes have occurred throughout history. Is it possible that an earthquake damaged the site so severely that it was buried for protection? Or consider this scenario: what if the burial represents a response to a solar event? Göbekli Tepe is oriented astronomically. Some scholars have speculated that the builders tracked not just regular celestial cycles but more dramatic phenomena, comets, meteor showers, or other apparitions in the sky. What if a major astronomical event, interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure or cosmic upheaval, prompted the decision to cover the site? These theories remain speculative. That's important to state clearly. We don't have definitive answers about why Göbekli Tepe was buried. But the fact that such varied and sophisticated theories compete for acceptance indicates something crucial: the people who built this site possessed enough cultural sophistication and theological complexity that their decisions can't be reduced to simple explanations. They had reasons for what they did. Those reasons existed within a rich framework of belief and meaning. What's remarkable is that the burial worked. It worked extraordinarily well. The site was so thoroughly covered that it remained hidden for more than 10,000 years. Modern archaeologists using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have revealed that we've only excavated perhaps 5% of the site. The majority of Göbekli Tepe remains beneath the earth, waiting. Unexcavated layers exist below the pillars we've already discovered. Chambers that have never been opened. Structures we haven't yet identified. The site continues to guard its secrets. This raises a fascinating question: what did the builders know about preservation? Did they understand, at some intuitive level, that covering the site would protect it from erosion, from weather, from decay? Or is it mere fortune that the burial also happened to preserve the structures themselves, protecting them from weathering that would have destroyed them over millennia? When you stand at Göbekli Tepe today and look at the partially excavated site, with its pillars rising from the earth and the surrounding region still mounded with unexcavated dirt, you're looking at more than an archaeological site. You're looking at a choice made by ancient peoples. A choice to cover, to conceal, to preserve for a future they could never have anticipated. It's a gesture that spans across 10,000 years and says something about how these people thought about time, legacy, and memory. Let's pause for a moment and reckon with something genuinely unsettling about Göbekli Tepe. It appears to represent a one-off in human history. There's nothing quite like it before, and nothing quite like it after. This is extraordinary. Usually, innovations in human behavior spread. If one group discovers how to make pottery, pottery making spreads to neighboring groups. If one society develops agriculture, neighboring societies eventually adopt it. Cultural innovations typically disseminate across regions and centuries. But monumental T-pillar construction appears to be unique to Göbekli Tepe. After the site was buried and abandoned, this specific architectural form disappears from the archaeological record. Later monumental architecture, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt, the megalithic structures of Europe, they're all constructed according to different principles, using different designs, reflecting different cosmologies. This suggests something important. Göbekli Tepe wasn't the beginning of a new cultural tradition. It was the culmination of one. It was the peak of a particular spiritual and architectural vision that had developed over centuries and was then abandoned, deliberately or not, at the moment of its greatest elaboration. Who were the people who built this? We can make educated inferences from skeletal remains and archaeological context. They were the pre-pottery Neolithic peoples of the Fertile Crescent, living in an ecological zone where wild cereals were abundant and wild game was plentiful. They were beginning to move towards sedentary settlement, but they hadn't yet made the full transition to agriculture. They lived at a liminal moment in human history, balanced between the mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle of their ancestors and the settled agricultural life that would characterize their descendants. Physical anthropologists have examined skeletal remains from the period and found evidence of significant physical labor. Strong muscle attachments. Evidence of trauma. But also evidence of general health and good nutrition. These weren't starving people on the edge of survival. They were well-fed people with enough surplus resources to undertake major construction projects. They had leisure time. They had the mental and physical capacity to imagine, plan, and execute something as ambitious as Göbekli Tepe. The skeletons also tell another story. These were people undergoing a transition. Evidence of zoonotic diseases, animal-derived illnesses, increases during this period. As humans began keeping animals in closer proximity, as agriculture intensified, new disease vectors emerged. Some scholars propose that diseases derived from domesticated animals may have accelerated the transition to agricultural settlement. If wild hunting grounds became dangerous, if wild animals became carriers of illness, sedentary agriculture might have seemed like a safer, more predictable way of life. But this is all still inference, educated guessing based on fragmentary remains. The truth is, we don't know who built Göbekli Tepe. We don't know their names, their kinship structures, their languages, their specific beliefs. We have evidence of their labor, of their sophistication, of their dedication to sacred work. But we don't have their voices. This is perhaps the deepest mystery of Göbekli Tepe. It's not a mystery that can be solved through excavation or laboratory analysis. It's a mystery that exists in the gap between the evidence we can accumulate and the lives we can never fully reconstruct. It's the fundamental distance between the present and the distant past, and all our tools for bridging it have inherent limitations. What we can say is this: whoever built Göbekli Tepe possessed a vision. A vision of something transcendent. A vision powerful enough to motivate hundreds of people to gather, to coordinate labor, to move massive stones for miles over difficult terrain, to carve them with precision, to arrange them according to meaningful patterns. They possessed the ability to inspire, to organize, to create meaning on a scale that transcended their immediate survival needs. And they possessed enough wisdom or foresight to recognize that this vision, in its particular form, needed to end. Needed to be buried. Needed to be preserved in the earth as a kind of time capsule, waiting for future generations to discover and wonder about. Here's something that most people don't realize about archaeological discoveries: they don't emerge in isolation. Every find carries with it a constellation of questions about all the other sites that haven't been excavated, all the structures that have been destroyed, all the knowledge that has been lost. Göbekli Tepe wasn't the beginning of monumental architecture in human history. It was just the oldest example we've found so far. But how many other pre-pottery Neolithic monuments have been destroyed? How many have been buried? How many have been lost to development, to erosion, to time? Consider Çatalhöyük, another pre-pottery Neolithic settlement in central Turkey, excavated over many seasons. It reveals a society of remarkable complexity, a densely packed village where homes were built adjacent to one another, where walls were covered in plaster and decorated with paintings, where it appears that some form of ritual veneration of animal remains occurred. The parallels to Göbekli Tepe suggest that this wasn't a cultural anomaly. This was part of a broader pattern of sophisticated pre-pottery Neolithic civilization. Or consider the Tel Qadi site in Israel, where massive stone towers have been excavated, structures that predate Göbekli Tepe slightly or are contemporary with it. These towers may have served defensive purposes or ritual purposes, or we're not entirely sure. But they indicate that monumental stone construction was emerging in multiple locations across the Near East during this period. It wasn't unique to Göbekli Tepe. The impulse to build was widespread. The mystery deepens when we consider what happened next. After the pre-pottery Neolithic, after Göbekli Tepe was buried, there's a period that archaeologists call the early pottery Neolithic. This period, which followed roughly 8,000 years before the present, saw the emergence of pottery technology and the intensification of agriculture. But it also saw, in many regions, a reduction in monumental architecture. Villages became smaller. Social complexity, at least as measured by archaeological remains, appears to have contracted in some areas. Some scholars propose a genuinely counterintuitive explanation: the adoption of agriculture may have actually represented a reduction in human autonomy and leisure time. If pre-pottery Neolithic peoples had enough surplus to undertake monumental projects like Göbekli Tepe, but later agricultural societies invested their time and resources in crop production and crop protection, then it's possible that intensified agriculture represented not progress but a different form of constraint. Societies had to work harder to feed larger populations. The leisure time available for ritual and monumental construction decreased. The great gathering sites were abandoned not because the capacity for civilization was lost, but because the economic and social conditions that had made them possible had changed. This theory has profound implications. It suggests that civilization, at least in the sense of monumental architecture, large-scale gathering, and ritual elaboration, didn't emerge because humans developed agriculture and became more organized. Instead, sophisticated social organization and monumental construction emerged first, during the pre-pottery Neolithic, in societies that hadn't yet committed fully to agriculture. Agriculture emerged later as a response to population pressure or environmental stress, and in some ways, it represented a constraint on the kinds of elaborate ritual and community life that had characterized the earlier period. If this is accurate, then the narrative of inevitable human progress becomes much more complicated. It's not a story of steady advancement from simple to complex, from savage to civilized. It's a story of different social forms emerging and persisting under different ecological and economic conditions. Some forms allow for elaborate ritual and monumental expression. Others prioritize production and population expansion. Both represent genuine human achievements, but they're built on different foundations. Göbekli Tepe becomes, in this interpretation, a monument to a road not taken. It represents a possibility, a way of organizing human society that prioritized gathering, ritual, and shared spiritual experience over accumulation and expansion. That way of organizing society didn't persist. But for centuries, it was viable. It worked. It produced sophisticated art, architecture, and theology. Let's examine some specific carvings in detail, because in those details lies evidence of a mind very different from our own, and yet recognizably human. Take the scorpion. Scorpions are dangerous creatures in the region where Göbekli Tepe stands. They represent threat, death, power. A carved scorpion at Göbekli Tepe isn't a naturalistic portrait of an insect. It's a symbol. The ancient artist understood something about the scorpion's character, its venom, its predatory cunning, its danger, and rendered that character in stone. But here's the thing, the scorpion isn't just carved. It's carved in relation to other creatures and symbols. The arrangement matters. The positioning matters. Some researchers have argued that the arrangement of carvings on the T-pillars represents a kind of cosmology, a map of the sacred universe as understood by the builders. In this interpretation, the pillars become three-dimensional texts. You walk around them and encounter a narrative written in stone. Similarly, the snakes depicted at Göbekli Tepe don't appear as simple naturalistic renderings. They're often shown in positions of interaction with other creatures or abstract forms. Some have suggested that snakes carry particular significance in pre-pottery Neolithic religion. Snakes shed their skins and are reborn. They possess venom, a kind of external power, separate from physical strength. They connect the earth, through burrowing, to the sky, through climbing. Snakes occupy liminal spaces, and in religious systems across many cultures, liminality carries spiritual significance. The most mysterious carvings, though, are the abstract symbols. Geometric patterns. Crosses. Swirls. Forms that don't clearly represent anything in the natural world. These are harder to interpret, and they've generated significant scholarly debate. Some researchers propose that these represent astronomical phenomena, star patterns, planetary movements, or other celestial events. Others suggest more abstract symbolic or religious content. Still others remain honestly uncertain about what these forms meant to their creators. One fascinating recent discovery involves evidence of use-wear on the T-pillars. The pillars, particularly at their tops, show evidence of being touched repeatedly over long periods of time. Hands rubbed against the stone. This suggests ritual practice, perhaps worshippers would come and touch the pillars as part of ceremonial practice. The pillars were objects to be engaged with physically, not just visually. They were meant to be touched, walked around, experienced in three-dimensional space. This detail is crucial because it transforms our understanding of Göbekli Tepe from an architectural site to an experimental space. It wasn't a museum or a gallery. It was a place where people came to participate in something. To touch sacred stone. To move through a landscape embedded with meaning. To position themselves within a cosmology rendered in stone. Some of the most evocative carvings involve what might be termed portraits of animals in unusual states. A wild boar that seems to be grimacing or expressing emotion. A snake in a position of confrontation or transformation. These creatures aren't rendered as static representations but as dynamic, engaged beings. The artists seem to have been interested in capturing not just the appearance of animals but their inner nature, their character, their power. This suggests a form of religious and artistic sophistication that rivals the greatest artistic traditions in human history. These weren't crude decorations. They were the work of people who had thought deeply about aesthetics, about representation, about how to convey meaning through visual form. In recent years, researchers have become increasingly convinced that Göbekli Tepe possessed an astronomical orientation that's only now being fully understood. Dr. Rita Gorch's work with ground-penetrating radar and careful analysis of pillar placement has revealed what appears to be deliberate astronomical alignment. The pillars seem to have been positioned to track the rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky and a celestial marker of profound significance in many ancient religious systems. If this interpretation holds, it suggests something extraordinary. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were tracking celestial cycles and encoding that knowledge into stone architecture. They were creating a monument that marked the turning of the cosmos. Every year, when Sirius rose at a particular angle, the people gathering at Göbekli Tepe would know that they were aligned with the ancient builders. They were witnessing the same star in the same position. They were synchronized with the cosmos. This carries implications about how these people experience time. They didn't just mark daily cycles or seasonal cycles. They were aware of the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble in Earth's orientation that causes different stars to mark the seasons over centuries. If Sirius was rising at specific positions, the builders would have needed to account for the fact that this would change over time. They would need to understand long-term cycles measured in centuries and millennia. That understanding of vast temporal scales is itself remarkable. It suggests that these people possessed a conception of history, a sense that the cosmos changes over long periods, that cycles repeat and transform, that the present is embedded in a much longer narrative of cosmic evolution. The astronomical interpretation also connects Göbekli Tepe to a long history of human engagement with the sky. Nearly every ancient civilization placed enormous importance on tracking celestial phenomena. The Egyptians aligned pyramids astronomically. The Maya built observatories. The peoples of Chaco Canyon in the American Southwest oriented their structures to track the sun's movement. If Göbekli Tepe represents the earliest known example of deliberate astronomical architecture, it places humanity's fascination with the cosmos in a much deeper historical context. This wasn't something that emerged with Egyptian civilization or Chinese civilization. It was fundamental to human consciousness from the very beginning. But here's where speculation becomes necessary, and it's important to mark this transition clearly. We don't actually know if the astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe were intentional or coincidental. We don't know if the builders possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge or if they were responding to religious and ceremonial needs that happened to align with astronomical phenomena. The evidence suggests intentionality, but definitive proof remains elusive. What we can say with confidence is that whoever built Göbekli Tepe was looking up. They were aware of the stars. They understood that the stars moved in patterns. They incorporated that understanding into their sacred architecture. Whether that understanding was intuitive and observational or deeply mathematical and theoretical, we may never know. Here's what keeps archaeologists awake at night about Göbekli Tepe: it's not just that the site is old. It's that the site is old and impressive. The level of sophistication, the scale of ambition, the artistic sophistication, all of this appears at a moment in human history when we expect to encounter people living in small, mobile bands with minimal social hierarchy and simple spiritual practices. Göbekli Tepe suggests that our models of human development have been wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, but wrong in important ways. The neat progression from simple hunter-gatherers to complex agricultural societies to urban civilizations, that progression turns out to be more complicated. There were moments when non-agricultural societies achieved remarkable sophistication. There were moments when sophisticated social organization emerged independent of agricultural surplus. This raises a question that scholars have been grappling with: why didn't this pattern continue? Why did the sophisticated pre-pottery Neolithic religious and architectural tradition not persist? Why did later societies not build on the foundation laid by Göbekli Tepe? Several theories compete for explanation. The first centers on environmental change. The Younger Dryas, the cold snap that may have prompted the initial construction at Göbekli Tepe, was followed by rapid warming. The climate stabilized. Vegetation patterns changed. This ecological transformation may have altered the conditions that had made Göbekli Tepe viable. If the site depended on gathering enough wild game to support feast ceremonies, and if game animals became more abundant but more dispersed, the economic foundation for large-scale gathering might have eroded. The second theory centers on disease. The transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture is often accompanied by an increase in infectious disease. Zoonotic diseases from animals. Parasitic infections from closer contact with animal waste. Higher population densities increasing the transmission of epidemic disease. Skeletal evidence from the pre-pottery Neolithic shows signs of increasing health stress and disease burden as time progressed. Population might have declined as disease increased, reducing the capacity for large-scale gathering and monumental construction. A third theory centers on religious and ideological change. Perhaps the beliefs that sustained Göbekli Tepe underwent transformation. New priesthoods emerged. New cosmologies took hold. The old monuments, associated with discredited beliefs, were abandoned. This would explain both why Göbekli Tepe was buried and why similar monuments don't appear in later periods. A religious reformation occurred, and the old religious infrastructure was deliberately set aside. A fourth theory, increasingly popular among scholars, centers on social fragmentation. Perhaps the conditions that had allowed multiple communities to gather in shared ritual sites became unsustainable as populations grew and competition for resources intensified. Communities turned inward. Localized societies emerged. The great pilgrimage sites of the pre-pottery Neolithic became impossible to maintain, or perhaps undesirable from the perspective of emerging local authorities who wanted to consolidate power within their own communities rather than participate in larger regional gathering. The truth might involve elements of all these theories. Complex historical changes rarely have single causes. Göbekli Tepe was probably abandoned as a result of multiple pressures, environmental, demographic, ideological, and social, acting simultaneously or in sequence. But this raises another question: did the people who buried Göbekli Tepe understand that they were ending something significant? Did they recognize that they were marking the conclusion of an era? Or did they experience it as simply the next step in an ongoing religious practice, not yet understanding that they were drawing a line under one chapter of human history and beginning another? We have no way to know. We can only observe the evidence, the intentional burial, the end of construction, the abandonment of the site. And we can wonder about the consciousness of the people who lived through that transition. One of the most illuminating ways to understand Göbekli Tepe is to place it alongside other ancient sites that have challenged conventional archaeological wisdom. Consider, for instance, the megaliths of Europe. Stonehenge, built roughly 6,000 years after Göbekli Tepe, represents another moment when pre-agricultural or recently agricultural societies invested enormous resources into monumental construction. Like Göbekli Tepe, Stonehenge appears to have been an astronomical observatory. Like Göbekli Tepe, it involved moving massive stones across difficult terrain. Like Göbekli Tepe, it speaks to a sophisticated understanding of geometry, astronomy, and cooperative labor. But Stonehenge was built by agricultural societies. By the time Stonehenge was constructed, agriculture had been established in Britain for nearly 1,000 years. Societies had developed the surplus necessary to support specialists, priests, astronomers, architects. Göbekli Tepe suggests that such sophisticated engineering and astronomy might emerge even before agriculture intensified. It pushes the timeline of human sophisticated thought further back than Stonehenge does. Or consider the monumental architecture of Mesoamerica. The pyramids of the Maya, the structures at Chichén Itzá and Tikal, represent the pinnacle of pre-Columbian architecture and engineering. These structures were built by agricultural societies, yes, but they were built roughly at the same time that Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilizations were developing writing and state structures. The sophistication of Mesoamerican architecture suggests that monumental construction and astronomical knowledge weren't invented in the Old World and then transmitted to the Americas. They emerged independently in multiple locations as human societies grappled with questions of meaning, the sacred, and permanence. Göbekli Tepe fits into this pattern of independent emergence of sophisticated practices. It suggests that monumental architecture and sophisticated astronomical understanding aren't outcomes of a particular cultural trajectory or contact between civilizations. They're more fundamental expressions of human consciousness. When conditions are right, when populations are stable enough to allow for communal effort, when spiritual beliefs are elaborate enough to demand permanent expression, when a society has enough leisure time to pursue such projects, monumental architecture tends to emerge. This has profound implications for how we understand human development. It suggests that humans, given the right conditions, are predisposed toward creating permanent structures, toward gathering in large communities, toward encoding knowledge in architecture and symbolic form. These aren't inventions that were discovered once and then spread. They're capacities that emerge independently whenever conditions allow. There's a class of ancient sites called lost cities that carry similar challenges to conventional archaeology: Petra, carved into rose-colored stone in Jordan and built by the Nabatean civilization. Borobudur, a massive Buddhist temple complex in Indonesia built around the 8th century. Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the largest religious monument in the world built by the Khmer civilization. Machu Picchu, the Incan citadel perched high in the Andes. Each of these represents an enormous investment of labor and resources into monuments to the sacred or the powerful. What Göbekli Tepe adds to this conversation is temporal depth. It pushes monumental architecture back 10,000 years earlier than these other examples. It suggests that the impulse to build, to create permanent structures, to express meaning in stone, this impulse is older in human history than we had previously recognized. It may be as old as complex thought itself. Let's linger for a moment on the evidence of feasting at Göbekli Tepe, because it reveals something profound about how these ancient communities understood gathering and belonging. The faunal remains, the bones of animals that were consumed in communal meals, tell a story about abundance, coordination, and shared resources. Imagine what a Göbekli Tepe feast might have looked like. Picture stone structures arranged in circles, each one a focal point. Picture torches or fires providing light as the sun set over the hills. Picture hundreds of people gathering from scattered settlements, traveling for days to converge on this sacred place. Picture animals roasting over fires. Picture the preparation of vast quantities of food. Picture the distribution of meat according to some system of fairness or ritual significance. Picture people singing, dancing, sharing stories. The evidence suggests that feasts occurred repeatedly over centuries. That means that each generation renewed the tradition. Each generation of leaders had to convince their people that it was worth the effort to travel to Göbekli Tepe, to participate in the gathering, to contribute labor toward maintaining or expanding the sacred site. That persistence speaks to the profound meaning that this gathering held in the collective imagination. Feasting serves multiple functions in human societies. It's nourishment, yes, but it's also social bonding. It's a moment of equality where hierarchical differences are temporarily suspended and people gather as a community. It's an opportunity to resolve conflicts, to forge alliances, to arrange marriages or other social contracts. The abundance of feast food signals wealth and generosity. The host who provides the feast gains prestige and social standing. For pre-pottery Neolithic societies, feasting may have served an additional function. It was a way of managing relationships between separate communities. In the absence of state-level political organization, relationships between groups had to be maintained through repeated interaction and gift exchange. Gatherings at Göbekli Tepe would have provided these opportunities. They would have created moments of intense bonding and interaction that reinforce social ties across the broader region. The sheer scale of these feasts, evidence suggests some may have involved several hundred participants, indicates remarkable coordination. Animals had to be hunted and preserved. Travel had to be organized. Some people had to make the journey while others stayed behind to tend settlements. Social roles had to be defined: who would hunt, who would cook, who would distribute food, who would lead ceremonies. The fact that this system persisted for centuries suggests that it became institutionalized. There were probably specialists, hunt leaders, feast coordinators, ritual directors, people who had particular roles in making these gatherings happen. This is important because it suggests that social differentiation, the emergence of leaders and specialists, wasn't something that emerged only after agriculture. It was already present at Göbekli Tepe. Some people had more authority than others. Some people made decisions that others deferred to. The foundation for hierarchical societies was already being laid at the pre-pottery Neolithic. We need to consider the possibility that Göbekli Tepe wasn't just a religious site in the way we think of churches or temples today. It was, perhaps, a gateway to another dimension of reality. A place where the sacred and the profane intersected. A location that possessed inherent spiritual power, independent of the buildings constructed there. The landscape itself is significant. Göbekli Tepe sits on a promontory, elevated above the surrounding terrain. On clear nights, the view of the stars would be extraordinary. The horizon would be visible in all directions. You could watch the sun rise and set. You could track celestial motion. You could feel connected to cosmic forces in a way that might be difficult if you were living in a dense settlement or in a valley with limited visibility. The pre-pottery Neolithic peoples of the region probably understood landscape as layered with meaning. Different places carried different kinds of power or significance. Holy mountains existed in their cosmology. Sacred springs. Dangerous regions. Places that were avoided. Places that were sought out. Göbekli Tepe, with its elevation and its visibility and its constructed monuments, would have been understood as a particularly powerful place. A thin place, as modern spiritual practitioners might say, a location where the boundary between material and spiritual worlds became permeable. If we accept this framework, then the construction of Göbekli Tepe wasn't about creating a new sacred space. It was about recognizing and elaborating on sacred space that already existed. The T-pillars weren't creating spiritual power so much as capturing it, anchoring it, making it visible and tangible. Shamanic traditions often speak of thin places, locations where spiritual energy is concentrated, where communication with other realms becomes easier. These places are identified through various means: unusual natural formations, astronomical alignments, historical associations with significant events. Once identified, they're often elaborated with structures designed to channel or amplify spiritual energy. Altars, standing stones, temples, shrines. If Göbekli Tepe emerged from this kind of spiritual recognition, then its construction wasn't unprecedented so much as following a pattern that exists across human societies. Humans identify spiritually significant places and then construct shrines or temples to mark and elaborate on them. We're doing the same thing today when we designate certain natural formations as sacred sites or construct churches in particular locations. The animals carved into the T-pillars would fit into this spiritual landscape. Different animals carry different kinds of spiritual power. The scorpion represents danger and death. The bull represents strength and earthiness. The snake represents transformation and liminality. By carving these animals into the pillars at a thin place, the builders may have been trying to incorporate these different forms of spiritual power into the site itself, making the location a repository for multiple kinds of sacred energy. This interpretation, speculative though it is, suggests that Göbekli Tepe emerges from a religious and spiritual framework that's not entirely foreign to us. We recognize the impulse to mark sacred places. We recognize the practice of pilgrimage. We recognize gathering for spiritual purposes. Göbekli Tepe is different in its scale and sophistication, but it's not entirely alien in its fundamental logic. The most tantalizing aspect of Göbekli Tepe is what remains unexcavated. Ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies have revealed that we've explored perhaps 5% of the site. Beneath the pillars we've uncovered, there are older levels. There are structures we haven't yet seen. There are chambers and passages that remain sealed. What could possibly be waiting there? Archaeological teams have identified anomalies in the radar images that could represent previously unknown structures. Some researchers have speculated about underground chambers that might contain artifacts or records. Some have wondered whether there might be evidence of writing, whether the people who built Göbekli Tepe might have developed symbolic systems more sophisticated than what we currently understand. The cautious response is that we simply don't know. Excavation is slow, painstaking work. There's no hurry. The site has waited 10,000 years. It can wait a few more. Each excavation season yields new discoveries and new questions. The pillars themselves revealed carvings that weren't visible until they were carefully uncovered and cleaned. Who knows what other surprises await? Some of the most intriguing possibilities involve what might be called archives. The T-pillars, with their carvings, could be understood as a form of information storage, a way of encoding knowledge into stone. If deeper excavations reveal additional carved surfaces or symbolic systems, they might unlock information about pre-pottery Neolithic cosmology, astronomy, or history that we currently can only infer. There's also the possibility of organic materials, preserved food remains, textiles, wood implements, bone tools. The arid climate of the region often preserves such materials well. If burial and sealing of the site protected organic materials from decay, there might be extraordinary preservation of artifacts that would normally decompose. Such discoveries could provide vivid, intimate evidence of daily life and material culture. Some more speculative archaeologists have wondered about the possibility of human remains, whether Göbekli Tepe might contain a sacred burial chamber with skeletal remains that could provide genetic information. We've already conducted genetic analysis on skeletons from the pre-pottery Neolithic, but more samples, particularly from a site as significant as Göbekli Tepe, could provide new insights into migration patterns, kinship networks, and disease burdens. There's also the possibility of disappointment. Excavations don't always yield spectacular discoveries. Deeper levels might be less spectacular than the T-pillars we've already uncovered. They might be harder to interpret. The unexcavated portions of the site might turn out to be less remarkable than speculation suggests. But there's something powerful about the fact that Göbekli Tepe remains partially hidden. It preserves mystery. It preserves possibility. It reminds us that we don't have complete knowledge of the past, that surprises await, that the historical record contains gaps and silences that technology and careful scholarship might yet illuminate. There's a strange duality at Göbekli Tepe that's worth exploring in some depth. The site was covered intentionally by ancient peoples, yes, but it's also being buried again, more slowly and less intentionally, by the process of ongoing archaeological excavation and research. What I mean is this: as archaeologists have excavated Göbekli Tepe, studied it, published papers about it, and shared it with the world, the site has been transformed. It's no longer a sleeping mystery, hidden beneath Turkish earth. It's become a tourist destination. Groups of visitors arrive regularly to walk among the pillars, to take photographs, to experience the site firsthand. The ground around the excavations has been trampled. The dust has been disturbed. This process is, to some extent, inevitable. Archaeological sites, once discovered, become public. They are studied. They're shared. The knowledge they contain becomes available to the broader human community. This is generally understood as progress, the expansion of human knowledge, the sharing of historical understanding. But there's also something being lost. The site silence is being broken. The mystery is being partially solved. The interpretations are being fixed into academic papers and popular accounts. Göbekli Tepe, which existed for 10,000 years as a buried mystery, is now being continuously inhabited and interpreted. It's being transformed from mystery to knowledge. This raises a philosophical question: is that transformation necessarily positive? Are we gaining something important by excavating and interpreting Göbekli Tepe? Absolutely. We're learning about human history. We're expanding our understanding of what humans are capable of. We're grappling with questions about meaning and spirituality that are relevant to our own time. But are we also losing something? Is there a value in mystery, in the unknown, in sites that lie quietly beneath the earth, waiting patiently for discovery? Some indigenous peoples have argued that sites shouldn't be excavated, that there's spiritual value in leaving them undisturbed. Some archaeologists have advocated for selective excavation, leaving portions of important sites deliberately unexcavated, preserving questions for future generations and future technologies. At Göbekli Tepe, this debate plays out quietly. Not all of the site has been excavated. Significant portions remain beneath the earth. In a sense, the ancient peoples who buried Göbekli Tepe are still protecting it. They're still concealing it. We've uncovered enough to be fascinated, but not so much that all mystery is exhausted. What's fascinating about Göbekli Tepe is how quickly it's entered popular imagination. Within a few years of its archaeological significance being widely recognized, the site became fodder for alternate history enthusiasts, conspiracy theorists, and spiritual seekers. Online communities debated whether Göbekli Tepe might be the historical basis for myths like Atlantis or the Garden of Eden. Some speculated about extraterrestrial involvement. Others proposed that the site represented surviving knowledge from earlier, lost civilizations. This is a predictable pattern with any archaeological mystery. The unknown attracts speculation. And there's nothing inherently wrong with speculation, as long as it's clearly marked as such. The problem arises when speculation is presented as fact, when gaps in knowledge are filled with confident assertions, when stories become more interesting than evidence. But it's also worth noting that popular interest in Göbekli Tepe has driven funding for research. Tourism has brought money to the region. The site has become a point of pride for Turkish archaeology and Turkish cultural heritage. The attention has, on balance, probably been beneficial for preservation and study. There are also some genuinely interesting Reddit threads, TikTok videos, and YouTube documentaries exploring Göbekli Tepe. The popular discourse around the site, while sometimes speculative, has also produced genuine insights. Non-professional archaeologists and history enthusiasts have proposed interpretations that match or challenge academic theories. The democratization of archaeological knowledge has, in some cases, enriched scholarly discourse. One particularly interesting phenomenon is the way Göbekli Tepe has become a touchstone for conversations about human potential and human limits. If ancient peoples could build something this sophisticated, then what else might they have accomplished that we don't know about? What abilities might they have possessed that were lost? This line of thinking can veer into pseudo-archaeology or fantasy, yes, but it can also inspire genuine curiosity about the capabilities of our ancestors. Is it possible that Göbekli Tepe survives in human memory despite being buried for 10,000 years? That folk traditions, myths, or legends might preserve some echo of the site or the people who built it? This is a deeply speculative question, but it's worth considering. Many archaeologists have noticed that ancient sites sometimes appear in local traditions. Kurdish shepherd communities living near Göbekli Tepe might have maintained oral stories about the site, even if those stories had become distorted over millennia. Archaeological excavation sometimes reveals that local legends were based on historical reality. The city of Troy, for instance, was considered mythical until excavation revealed it actually existed. Some researchers have speculated about whether Göbekli Tepe might be connected to Mesopotamian flood myths or to stories about pre-Diluvian civilizations. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, there are references to ancient times, to ancestral knowledge, to catastrophic events that transformed civilization. Could these myths preserve some cultural memory of the pre-pottery Neolithic period? Could Göbekli Tepe represent a historical reality that became mythologized in later traditions? Again, this is speculation. The time gap between Göbekli Tepe and the earliest written myths is enormous, 6,000 years or more. Stories don't survive unchanged across such time spans. They're transformed, elaborated, reinterpreted. The connection between archaeological evidence and mythological record is tenuous at best. But the fact that humans create and preserve stories about the past is itself significant. It suggests that we've always been interested in origins, in history, in understanding where we come from. Göbekli Tepe represents a moment in human history when that interest was already present. The people who gathered at Göbekli Tepe were thinking about their past, their traditions, their spiritual heritage. They were encoding meaning into stone so that it would survive. They were, in a sense, creating a record for future generations to discover. Let's return to the astronomy question, because recent research has raised fascinating new possibilities. If the T-pillars at Göbekli Tepe were indeed positioned to align with celestial phenomena, then the site functions as a kind of three-dimensional astronomical calendar. But the significance of this goes beyond mere record-keeping or ceremonial timing. An astronomical calendar serves a practical function in societies that depend on knowing when to plant and when to harvest. But it serves a deeper symbolic function as well. It connects human communities to cosmic cycles. It affirms that human time is not isolated but embedded in larger cosmic patterns. It suggests a cosmology in which the earth and sky are connected, in which human actions and cosmic cycles are resonant. The pre-pottery Neolithic peoples of the Near East would have understood the night sky differently than we do. Without light pollution, the stars would be extraordinarily bright. The Milky Way would be visible as a brilliant river of light. The planets would be visible as the bright wandering stars, the meaning of the word planet. Comets and meteors would be more frequently observed. The night sky would have been an overwhelming presence, impossible to ignore. In such an environment, tracking celestial movements isn't merely practical. It's existential. You can't help but be aware that the sky changes, that patterns repeat, that the cosmos possesses a kind of order. Building a monument that encodes this astronomical knowledge is a way of saying, we understand something about how the cosmos works. We understand the patterns. We've captured that understanding in stone. We're connected to something larger than ourselves. If Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, was indeed significant to the builders of Göbekli Tepe, then we need to consider why. Sirius has been associated with kingship and divinity in many ancient cultures, including Egypt. It marks the beginning of the Egyptian year. It's associated with the Nile's flooding. In pre-pottery Neolithic times, long before Egypt emerged as a civilization, Sirius would still have been the brightest star, still rising at particular times, still marking cosmic cycles. Perhaps the pre-pottery Neolithic peoples of the Near East recognized Sirius as significant. Perhaps they associated it with a particular deity or spiritual force. Perhaps they built Göbekli Tepe partly as a way of honoring Sirius, of aligning themselves with the power that this brightest star represented. History doesn't proceed in straight lines, but sometimes we can trace the echoes of a single event or innovation rippling forward through time. Göbekli Tepe represents an innovation, not just architectural or technological, but conceptual. It represents the idea that it's worth enormous effort to create something permanent, something symbolic, something that speaks to transcendent meaning. That idea took root. It evolved. It transformed. It manifested in different forms across different regions and centuries. The monumental stone structures that emerged across Europe in the Neolithic period, the dolmens, the passage tombs, the stone circles, they all emerge from similar impulses. The impulse to create something permanent. The impulse to mark sacred space. The impulse to leave a record for future generations. The Minoan temples of Crete, built thousands of years after Göbekli Tepe, share characteristics with it. They're locations of religious gathering. They're architecturally sophisticated. They're aligned with astronomical phenomena. They represent communities coordinating labor towards spiritual ends. The Mayan structures of Mesoamerica, built even later, echo similar patterns. They're monumental. They're architecturally sophisticated. They encode astronomical knowledge. They represent the culmination of cultural and spiritual traditions developed over centuries. Göbekli Tepe isn't the direct ancestor of all later monumental architecture. Different cultures developed their own architectural traditions, independent of one another. But Göbekli Tepe represents the emergence of a fundamental pattern in human culture. When people have the resources and the social organization to do so, they create monuments. They encode meaning in permanent structures. They gather for spiritual purposes. This pattern is ancient. It's deep in human nature. It's not something that was invented once and then spread. It's something that humans discovered independently, again and again, as conditions allowed. Göbekli Tepe is simply the oldest known expression of this pattern. But it's unlikely to be the only pre-pottery Neolithic monumental site. As archaeologists continue working in the Near East and beyond, they may well discover other sites of comparable age and sophistication. Each discovery like that will push our understanding of human potential further back in time. Each site will suggest that the capacity for sophisticated cultural expression, for monumental ambition, for spiritual elaboration, these capacities are older in human history than we had previously recognized. One aspect of Göbekli Tepe that often gets overlooked is the sophisticated technology required to create the T-pillars. These weren't simple stones. They were carved, shaped, rendered into artistic forms. Techniques had to exist for doing this carving. Tools had to exist. Knowledge had to exist about how to work stone, how to apply force effectively, how to achieve the desired aesthetic result. Archaeological analysis of the pillars reveals something interesting: they were carved using stone tools. Not metal tools, metallurgy hadn't yet been developed. Stone striking stone. But the precision of the carving suggests real expertise. Someone understood stone. Someone understood how to achieve clean cuts and precise shapes. Someone had developed techniques that allowed for detailed artistic expression. This knowledge presumably had developed over generations. The first T-pillar probably wasn't perfect. Trial and error, experimentation, refinement, for across decades or centuries, stone carving techniques were developed and perfected. By the time Göbekli Tepe was at its height, the technology of stone carving was sophisticated enough to produce carvings of real artistic merit. The scale of the quarrying operation needed to produce the T-pillars is also worth considering. These stones had to be extracted from bedrock, shaped, and then transported across sometimes difficult terrain. This required coordination. It required knowledge about how to move massive weights. It required engineering. Recent research has suggested that the stones might have been quarried on-site or nearby, which would have reduced transportation distances. But quarrying itself is labor-intensive. You need to identify suitable stone. You need to understand grain and stress points. You need to extract the stone without shattering it. You need to move it to the construction site. All of this speaks to accumulated knowledge. Someone in pre-pottery Neolithic society possessed expertise in these areas. Whether this was the result of apprenticeship systems, of empirical experimentation, or of some combination, we don't know. But the knowledge clearly existed. The technical capacity to undertake Göbekli Tepe's construction clearly existed. We don't know when ceremonies at Göbekli Tepe occurred. We don't know if they were seasonal or year-round. We don't know if they coincided with hunts or harvests or specific astronomical events. But we can speculate based on what we know about how pre-pottery Neolithic peoples lived. They moved seasonally. Different resources were available at different times of year. Wild plants bore fruit in summer. Game animals migrated. Seasonal patterns dominated the human calendar. Ceremonies probably aligned with these seasonal patterns. Feasts might have occurred after successful hunts. Gatherings might have coincided with the ripening of certain plants or the arrival of migrating birds. If Göbekli Tepe was indeed positioned to mark celestial events like the rising of Sirius, then ceremonies might have been scheduled around these astronomical events. Imagine a particular time of year approaches. The night sky shows signs. The Sirius rises at a particular angle. People begin traveling from their scattered settlements. They converge on Göbekli Tepe. They gather at the stone monuments. They celebrate, feast, and reaffirm their connection to each other and to the cosmos. This seasonal gathering model explains several things. It explains why Göbekli Tepe is near permanent water sources. People traveling to the site needed access to water. It explains the evidence of massive feasting. People gathering seasonally would undertake large ritual meals to mark the occasion. It explains the astronomical orientation. If ceremonies were astronomical, the builders would want the site positioned to capture those astronomical events. The seasonal gathering model also explains something else: mobility. We often think of pre-pottery Neolithic settlement as the beginning of sedentary life. But the reality is more complex. People didn't suddenly stop moving. They began establishing base camps or seasonal settlements that they returned to repeatedly. They maintained network connections across larger distances. They participated in regional gathering sites while maintaining more local settlements. Göbekli Tepe fits into this emerging pattern of regional gathering sites. It's not a permanent settlement where people lived year-round. It's a destination. A place people travel to. A node in a network of settlements and gathering places that characterized pre-pottery Neolithic society. One of the great mysteries surrounding Göbekli Tepe is whether the carvings represent some form of proto-writing. Were the abstract symbols a precursor to written language? Or were they purely decorative and symbolic, without the systematic organization that characterizes writing? This is a genuinely difficult question to answer. Writing systems develop gradually. Early symbol systems often serve religious or administrative purposes. Cuneiform in Mesopotamia emerged from accounting practices. Egyptian hieroglyphics may have emerged from similar practical needs. Chinese characters evolved from pictographic representations. The symbols carved at Göbekli Tepe are abstract, yes, and they appear in repeated patterns. Some researchers have speculated that they might represent a symbol system. But we lack the evidence necessary to confirm that these symbols constituted writing. We'd need a larger sample of symbols, clear evidence of systematic usage, and ideally some key like the Rosetta Stone that would allow us to interpret the meaning. Without these elements, we can't conclude definitively that writing existed at Göbekli Tepe. But we also can't rule it out. The possibility remains tantalizingly open. Future excavations might reveal evidence of a more elaborate symbol system. Ground-penetrating radar might reveal surfaces with more extensive symbolic carving. The significance of this uncertainty is worth contemplating. If writing wasn't invented until thousands of years after Göbekli Tepe, then the site represents a culture of immense sophistication and complexity that left no written records. Everything we know about these people is inferred from material remains, the bones they left behind, the stones they carved, the architecture they built. We've lost the possibility of hearing their own words, understanding their own interpretations of what they were doing. That absence, that silence, is profound. It means we're forever separated from the people of Göbekli Tepe by an unbridgeable gap. We can understand their material culture. We can infer their beliefs and practices. But we can never truly hear from them. We can never read their explanations of why they built what they built or what it meant to them. Let's consider the possibility that Göbekli Tepe's abandonment was sudden and catastrophic. Not a gradual transition, but a collapse. A moment when the world of the pre-pottery Neolithic people suddenly shifted, and the conditions that had made Göbekli Tepe viable ceased to exist. What could cause such a collapse? Multiple possibilities exist. A plague that wiped out significant portions of the population. A failed harvest cycle that made gathering large numbers of people untenable. An earthquake or other geological event that damaged the site or the surrounding region. A military invasion or conquest by peoples with different beliefs and practices. Or consider the possibility of a religious upheaval. A charismatic figure emerges with a new spiritual vision. The old priesthood is displaced. The old monuments are rejected as associated with discredited beliefs. The people who had maintained Göbekli Tepe lose their authority. The new leaders decide that the site must be buried, sealed away, rendered taboo. If such a rupture occurred, it would explain several features of the archaeological record. It would explain why Göbekli Tepe was buried. The new religious authorities wanted to erase evidence of the old religion. It would explain why similar monuments don't appear in subsequent periods. The new religious and social order didn't value monumental stone construction. It would explain why the pre-pottery Neolithic eventually gave way to different cultural systems. This scenario, the emergence of new religious or political systems that rejected the old ways, isn't unprecedented in human history. It happened repeatedly as civilizations rose and fell. It's plausible that it happened at the transition from pre-pottery Neolithic to pottery Neolithic as well. But it remains speculation. The archaeological evidence doesn't definitively point to catastrophe. It could simply point to gradual abandonment as economic and social conditions changed. The absence of evidence for catastrophe could simply reflect the fact that gradual changes don't leave dramatic traces in the archaeological record. One of the most interesting recent developments in research on Göbekli Tepe has been increasing attention to climate and environmental factors. The site was constructed during the pre-pottery Neolithic, a period of environmental change and instability. The Younger Dryas, the cold snap from roughly 12,800 to 11,700 years ago, created challenging conditions. Temperatures dropped. Vegetation patterns shifted. Animal populations changed. Paradoxically, Göbekli Tepe was constructed right as these environmental stresses were beginning. This has led some researchers to propose that monumental building and ritual intensification are human responses to environmental uncertainty. When the world becomes less predictable, when survival becomes less certain, humans respond by intensifying symbolic practice and social bonding. This thesis is supported by research on societies across the world. When environments become unpredictable, societies often invest heavily in ritual, in religious elaboration, in community gathering. These practices serve important psychological and social functions. They reduce anxiety. They reinforce social bonds. They create a sense of collective agency and meaning. If this theory is correct, then Göbekli Tepe represents humanity's earliest known engagement with a fundamental survival strategy. When external conditions become threatening, build stronger internal community. Create monuments to shared meaning. Gather together. Reinforce your connections to each other and to the sacred. As climate change begins affecting human societies in the present day, this historical parallel becomes interesting to consider. We face environmental uncertainty and climate instability. Are we seeing increased investment in ritual and symbolic practice? Are we seeing intensified efforts to create community and meaning? The evidence might suggest that we are. Göbekli Tepe reminds us that humans have faced environmental threats before. We've responded with creativity and community building. We've created monuments to persist across time. We've gathered together to face uncertainty. That same capacity exists in us today. We've covered a lot of ground in exploring Göbekli Tepe. We've discussed the archaeological evidence, the theories of scholars, the various interpretations and speculations. But before we conclude, it's important to acknowledge something crucial: we have fundamental limits in how well we can interpret the deep past. We can observe material remains. We can analyze stone and bone. We can use technology like ground-penetrating radar to reveal hidden structures. But we can't actually talk to the people who built Göbekli Tepe. We can't ask them what they were thinking. We can't watch their ceremonies. We can't understand their languages or their specific beliefs. Everything we've discussed about Göbekli Tepe involves interpretation. Some interpretations are more well supported by evidence than others. Some are highly speculative. But all of them are inferences from material evidence. We're reading meaning into stone and bone and spatial arrangements. We're making educated guesses about what these people valued and believed. This is important to keep in mind when encountering more speculative theories about Göbekli Tepe. Some people speculate about alien involvement, about advanced technology, about lost knowledge. These theories misunderstand something fundamental. Göbekli Tepe is impressive precisely because it was built by ordinary humans using Stone Age technology. The sophistication of the site speaks to human ingenuity and commitment, not to alien intervention or supernatural intervention. But there's also wisdom in acknowledging that we don't know everything. The site remains partially excavated. New discoveries continue to be made. Technologies that don't yet exist may one day allow us to interpret evidence we currently can't read. The mysteries at Göbekli Tepe aren't weaknesses in our knowledge. They're reminders that the past remains partially hidden, accessible only through careful work and respectful interpretation. Göbekli Tepe's greatest legacy might be the questions it forces us to ask about ourselves. What are we capable of? What drives us to create permanent structures, to gather in community, to express meaning through art and architecture? Why do we build monuments? Why do we need ritual? Why do we seek the transcendent? The answers to these questions probably have deep evolutionary roots. Humans are creatures who live in narrative. We need meaning. We need community. We need to position ourselves within larger frameworks of significance. For hundreds of thousands of years, we've done this through art, through ritual, through sacred gathering. Göbekli Tepe is the oldest known monument to these impulses. It's the oldest gathering place, the oldest temple, the oldest expression of the need for something beyond mere survival. And it's deeply, profoundly human. There's nothing alien about it. There's nothing supernatural about it. It's simply what humans do when conditions allow. We create meaning. We build community. We reach for something sacred. That impulse hasn't disappeared. We still create monuments. We still gather for ritual and ceremony. We still need art and symbol and transcendence. Göbekli Tepe reminds us that these aren't modern inventions or distractions from real survival needs. They're fundamental to what it means to be human. They're as ancient as our species. They're as important to our survival as food and shelter. In a world increasingly characterized by fragmentation, by isolation, by the erosion of community and shared meaning, Göbekli Tepe offers a different model. It shows us a time when humans gathered together, created meaning together, built something significant together. It shows us that we're capable of more than mere survival. We're capable of vision, of commitment, of creating something that outlasts us and speaks to future generations. Imagine standing at Göbekli Tepe on a clear night, centuries ago. The stars above are brilliant. The T-pillars rise around you, casting shadows in the torchlight. The smell of roasting meat fills the air. The sound of voices, singing, chanting, praying, echoes off the stone. The person beside you has traveled for days to be here. The person on your other side is a stranger from a distant settlement. But tonight, you're united. United in community. United in the recognition that you're part of something larger than yourself. United in the presence of the sacred. You reach out and touch one of the pillars. Your hand meets stone carved thousands of years before you were born, by hands belonging to people whose names you'll never know. You feel the texture of the carved animals. You sense the intentionality in the shaping of stone. You understand, in that moment, that someone decided that this mattered. That someone wanted to create something that would last. That impulse to create permanence, the desire to reach across time with a message carved in stone, it connects you to the builders of Göbekli Tepe. You're separated by 10,000 years, by vastly different technologies, by languages that share no words. But you're united in the recognition that meaning matters. That community matters. That the sacred is worth pursuing. As we conclude this exploration of Göbekli Tepe, we're left with questions that point toward the future. Archaeological work continues at the site. New technologies continue to emerge. New sites from the pre-pottery Neolithic period continue to be discovered and excavated. What will we learn in the coming decades? Will new excavations reveal chambers containing artifacts we can't yet imagine? Will we decode the symbolic systems carved into the pillars? Will we discover other sites of comparable sophistication and age? Will we find evidence that connects the people of Göbekli Tepe to later civilizations and belief systems? And perhaps most importantly, what will Göbekli Tepe teach us about ourselves? What does it say about human nature that we've always been driven to build, to gather, to create meaning? What does it say about our capacity for vision and commitment? What does it say about the fundamental importance of community and the sacred in human life? Göbekli Tepe broke the conventional narrative of human progress. It showed us that our ancestors were more sophisticated, more ambitious, more spiritually conscious than we had given them credit for. In doing so, it broke our understanding of history itself. It invited us to reimagine what's possible when humans coordinate their efforts toward transcendent ends. The stones of Göbekli Tepe have waited in the earth for 10,000 years. They've waited patiently for us to discover them. And now that we have, they're asking us to reconsider everything we thought we knew. They're asking us to see our ancestors not as primitive precursors to ourselves, but as fully human, fully conscious, fully capable of vision and meaning-making. In the Turkish hills where those ancient builders once gathered, the pillars still stand. They've weathered millennia. They've survived the transition from pre-pottery Neolithic to agricultural settlement, from ancient times to classical antiquity, from medieval periods to the modern world. They've endured through countless political upheavals, through wars and peace, through all the changes that have transformed the world around them. And they are still asking the same questions that they asked 10,000 years ago. What is sacred? What is worth building for? What will we choose to create that will outlast us? What will we choose to preserve for a future we cannot predict? Göbekli Tepe stands at the intersection of past and present, between the material and the transcendent, between what we know and what remains mysteriously, tantalizing hidden. It's a monument to human possibility. It's a challenge to our assumptions about what ancient peoples were capable of. And it's an invitation to consider what we ourselves might create if we gathered our collective will toward transcendent ends. The temple that broke history continues to break our assumptions about who we are and what we're capable of becoming. And in that breaking, it opens new possibilities. New understandings. New ways of seeing ourselves and our deep past. That is the true legacy of Göbekli Tepe. There are places on Earth where something fundamental shifts. Not a physical change you can touch or measure, but something deeper. A feeling. A presence. The kind of sensation that makes your skin prickle and your breath catch in your throat without knowing why. These places exist everywhere, in the old forests where the canopy is so dense that daylight never quite reaches the forest floor, where the trees seem older than civilization itself and grow so close together that sunlight becomes a distant memory. On remote hillsides wrapped in perpetual mist, where massive stones rise from the earth like the spines of sleeping giants, stones so ancient that no living person can remember who placed them there or why. at the edges of windswept moors at dusk, when the fading light plays tricks on your eyes and the wind through the heather sounds almost like whispered voices calling a name you almost recognize but can never quite grasp. The Celtic peoples called these places thin places. Not because of any physical property of the landscape, but because in these locations, the boundary between the world we know and something else, something vast, old, and fundamentally different, felt almost permeable. As if you could reach out and touch the fabric separating two realities and find it paper thin. Gossamer thin. Fragile as a spider's web caught between worlds. But here's what most people don't understand about these thin places. They weren't haunted by ghosts. They weren't populated by cute little nature spirits wearing flower crowns and dancing under moonlight. These places were something far stranger, far older, and infinitely more complicated. They were the dwelling places of beings that were once worshipped as gods. And their fall from divinity is one of the most profound and haunting stories in human mythology. This is the true history of the fairies. And it's nothing like you've been told. To understand the fairies, you first have to understand that they were never, in their original conception, small or cute or benevolent. They were gods. The Celtic peoples believed that Ireland, and Scotland, and Wales, and all the lands of the Celtic world were inhabited by two civilizations simultaneously. One was visible, the one we know. The one where humans lived and worked and died. But woven into the very fabric of that world was another civilization entirely. The people called it the Ishi, or sometimes the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Thanu. These weren't primitive nature spirits. They were described in the ancient texts as beings of immense power. They had arrived in Ireland from the mythical northern cities of the ancient world carrying with them for great treasures, a stone that would cry out when a true king stood upon it, a spear that could never miss its target, a sword that no one could escape from, and a cauldron that could feed any army and never run empty. These treasures weren't metaphorical. They were understood as real objects of power, evidence that the Ishi possessed knowledge and capabilities far beyond what humans possessed. According to the medieval Irish texts, the Ishi didn't just live alongside humans. They ruled. They had their own kings, their own political structures, their own laws. They lived in the great mounds that dotted the Irish landscape, structures called side, pronounced she, which archaeological evidence now suggests were genuine pre-Christian ceremonial sites and burial mounds constructed over thousands of years. But in the Celtic mind, these weren't just ancient graves or meeting places. They were the palaces and strongholds of an entire civilization. The Ishi were beautiful beyond human comprehension. The texts describe them as eternally young, never aging, never becoming tired or sick. They possessed magic that seemed to defy the laws of nature. They could shape-shift, they could travel between the physical world and something else entirely, they could see the future and bend fate itself. Most importantly, they could grant or withhold blessings. Fertility. Health. Victory. A good harvest. All the things that determined whether a human community thrived or perished, these were controlled by the Ishi. This is why the Celtic peoples developed such an intricate, careful, almost obsessive relationship with these beings. This wasn't worship in the way we think of modern religion. It was something more like a treaty between two neighboring powers. You respected them. You offered them tributes. You followed their laws. And in return, they didn't destroy you. But that was the ancient understanding. Everything changed when a new god arrived on the islands. When Christianity arrived in Ireland, it came gradually. Not as conquest at first, but as influence. Missionaries. Monks. The slow, inexorable spread of a new spiritual framework. And as Christianity took hold, the Ishi faced an impossible choice. They couldn't be killed by the new faith. The texts make this clear repeatedly. But they could be diminished. Reinterpreted. The very religious structure that had once honored them as equals, as beings worthy of tribute and fear, now branded them as demons. Or worse, as nothing. Forgotten remnants of a pagan past. According to some accounts in the medieval texts, the Ishi made a deliberate choice. Faced with a world that no longer believed in them, that was actively trying to erase them from history and spiritual reality, they withdrew. They used their remaining power to retreat into the thin places, deeper into the mounds, into the forests, into the spaces between the physical world and something else. They became hidden. They became secret. But withdrawal from the world came at a cost. The beings who had once been called gods found themselves trapped in a kind of suspension. Neither fully present in the human world, nor fully removed from it. Existing in a perpetual twilight. Still powerful, still capable of affecting human affairs, but cut off from the open worship and fear that had sustained them. Cut off from the acknowledgement of their true nature. This is the moment of their transformation. From gods to what we now call fairies. Not a gentle descent into myth, but a tragic diminishment. A forced exile into the margins of reality. And as centuries passed, as the memory of what they truly were faded, a new mythology grew up around them. The stories changed. They went from being described as majestic and terrible to being depicted as small, mischievous, capricious. The ancient texts speak of the Tuatha De Danann with respect and fear. By the medieval period, the stories tell of fairies with more affection, more whimsy, more distance. It's as if humanity itself was forgetting what these beings were, and in forgetting, was creating a version of them that was less threatening. Less complicated. Less real. But the beings themselves never forgot. And some of the old stories still contain echoes of their true nature, if you know where to listen. Once the Ishi had retreated into the hidden world, the ancient texts and folklore began to describe them as organized into two great factions. Each had its own character, its own laws, its own relationship with humanity. The first was called the Selai Court, the blessed or fortunate court. These were the fairies who were said to be capable of blessing humans, of helping them, of bestowing gifts. But and this is crucial, the help of the Selai Court came with conditions. Nothing was ever given freely. Every gift came with an invisible price, an obligation, a debt that might not be called due for years or even generations. A young woman might receive a blessing of exceptional beauty, but she would never bear children. A farmer might be granted an extraordinarily abundant harvest, but the following year his crops would fail regardless of his efforts. A warrior might receive supernatural strength, but his luck in love would be permanently cursed. The logic here is almost economic. The Selai Court operated by a system of balance. Energy couldn't be created or destroyed, it could only be transferred. If you received a blessing, something of equal value had to be taken from you somewhere else. The fairies weren't cruel in their application of this law, they were simply indifferent. They followed the rules of their universe, rules that were so fundamentally alien to human morality that they seemed merciless only when viewed from a human perspective. There are countless medieval stories that capture this dynamic. A woman is granted the ability to sing so beautifully that anyone who hears her will fall in love with her, but her voice will eventually drive men to madness, causing them to waste away from unrequited longing. A man is given the gift of never being able to be killed in battle, but he will live to see everyone he loves die before him, and he will eventually perish in a mundane accident that mocks his warrior status. A child is stolen by the fairies and replaced with a changeling, but the stolen child grows up in the fairy world, eternally beautiful and young, never aging, never dying, but also never truly living, trapped in a kind of magical stasis. The Selai Court represented a version of divine power that was not evil but utterly, fundamentally unconcerned with human suffering or human concepts of morality. They were beautiful. They were willing to help. But engaging with them was like making a deal with a force of nature. You might survive the transaction. But you would survive changed. Diminished. Forever marked by your contact with the divine. If the Selai Court represented indifferent, transactional divinity, the Unseelie Court represented something far darker. These were the fairies who had no interest in blessing humans. Their relationship with humanity was predatory, hostile, chaotic. According to the folklore, the Unseelie Court existed in a state of perpetual rage, rage at their diminishment, rage at being forgotten, rage at being trapped in the thin places while the world moved on without them. The most famous manifestation of the Unseelie Court's power was something called the Wild Hunt. According to accounts that appeared across Celtic and Germanic Europe, on certain nights, particularly around Samhain, the festival when the boundaries between worlds grew thin, a great procession would ride through the sky or across the land. Spectral riders on spectral horses, hunting some invisible prey with hounds that howled like the damned. Anyone caught out on the roads during the wild hunt was in mortal danger. The riders might snatch you up and carry you away to the fairy realm, from which you would return, if you returned at all, years later, only to discover that centuries had passed in the human world. Or they might shoot you with invisible arrows, marked with an illness that would slowly consume you from within. Or they might simply pass over you, and you would be found the next morning, aged decades, your mind shattered. The wild hunt wasn't just a supernatural phenomenon.